Hi, Oliver.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm well. Yeah.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, and this is the Wright Show on meaningoflife.tv. You are Oliver Burkeman. You write for The Guardian.
That's right.
You write a column whose humble title is, will you tell us?
It's called "This Column Will Change Your Life." I'm still, to this day, explaining to people that it's meant to be a joke.
Uh-huh. Have you ever gotten complaints from people who say they read it and it didn't change their life, except for making them a little annoyed with you?
Yeah, sporadically, I do get those complaints.
Yeah.
I try to explain. Firstly, it's meant tongue in cheek. Secondly, it depends how you define change, doesn't it?
Right. I mean, if they wouldn't have written you the note complaining if it hadn't had some impact on their lives.
Their lives came out slightly differently as a result of that.
So there you go. What we're going to actually talk about mainly is not your column, but your book, The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking. I can't hold the physical book up because I've been listening to it as an audiobook from audible.com, so I'm holding my smartphone up, but same idea, you get it.
Yeah, and it's appropriate that you have a cracked screen, I think, to the general feel.
Oh, you saw that. That's still kind of a traumatic memory for me. I wish you wouldn't have brought that up. Although, your book is all about confronting the traumatic and the negative and not running from it, right? Among other things. So maybe you'll be a good therapy for me. But yeah, this happened within the last few weeks, and it's a pretty new phone, so it's kind of a sensitive subject, Oliver. So anyway, how'd you get interested in this? I mean, you start the book with a scene where you're at one of these positive thinking assembly. I guess is it a preacher who's exhorting you to think positively at that point, or is it a secular self-help guy in the beginning?
The event is secular, but the guy who I was quoting at the beginning there was the guy called Robert Schuller, who was the
Crystal Cathedral guy.
Crystal Cathedral, exactly. Yeah.
And is this how you got interested in the book, through annoyance with exhortations to think positively, or what?
Yeah, I went to that event after I was embarked on this project, so I maybe wasn't the most neutral observer in history by the time I was at that motivational seminar in the basketball stadium in Texas. But I'd been consuming, mainly for this column, huge amount of popular psychology, explicit self-help, but sometimes just, writing about happiness. And I've been trying to sort of sort the wheat from the chaff. That's the idea behind the column, still to this day, pretty much. It just seemed like an awful lot of the stuff that didn't seem to work and that didn't have research backing seemed to fall into this bucket that you could broadly define called positive thinking. So I began to sort of see that as the organizing principle behind what seemed to work and what didn't. Everything that seems to have more going for it seems more to do with getting friendlier with negative emotions or not running away from them. And you start to see positive thinking as this very sort of, it's sort of an allergy to being able, it's very intolerant and brittle kind of way to be, I feel like.
And you do, I mean, this theme allows you to weave together a lot of strands, including from ancient thought. So Stoicism and Buddhism and so on, a lot of these things fit together nicely in the book. Is it possible to say what the main problem is with positive thinking, or whether you're even really categorically against it per se? You sound pretty against it in the book, I gotta say. But what's the problem with positive thinking?
I think the easiest way of talking about it is to say probably that the attempt to control your emotions and also, your behavior and outcomes in the world as well by means of the conscious will, is our ability to do that is way more limited than we tend to think, and much more limited than positive thinking gurus tend to assume, and that you get a lot of, ironic effects, such as those that Daniel Wegner, the Harvard psychologist, studied in such depth, where it's all this stuff, try not to think of a white bear and all you can think of is a white bear. Try to eliminate anxiety. It's a very anxious way to live. These kind of things recur again and again, that basic pattern. And so I think it's that sort of idea of trying to make things okay through force of will. I don't think that's the same as saying that, if you're a natural optimist, that's a bad thing and you should snap out of it. Mm-hmm. Although, I think there's upsides to deliberately cultivating pessimism sometimes too, which I do write about. But I think it's that sort of try hard thing. It's trying too hard to be happy.
Mm-hmm. So what? And as I said, there are various schools of thought that historically have kind of been on your side in this argument, and they do go back all the way to Stoicism. And you deal with Stoics pretty early in the book. What? Say a little bit about how the Stoics handled the issue.
Well, because one way of looking at this, I always think, is that almost all philosophy and thinking about happiness is on this side. It's only the last sort of 120 years of positive thinking that is different. I sort of plunged into Stoicism in a really sort of unfocused way, and I ended up really just bringing small parts of it out that spoke to me rather than some sort of comprehensive study of it. But a bit that really resonated and that I write about is this idea of negative visualization, the premeditation of evils, they called it. This idea of deliberately cultivating thinking about the worst case scenario. So.
And what is the virtue of that? Is that just to facilitate kind of good, cautious, careful planning, or is it deeper than that? What kind of thing might you, if you were a practicing Stoic today, and there are actual practicing Stoics today, there's a little bit of a kind of revival of Stoicism as a formal practice.
Absolutely.
And what's an example of this kind of, what might you think of? What negative thing might you think of as part of the Stoic discipline?
I think, if you're approaching some event or experience with great anxiety, so, public speaking is the obvious example of something kind of terrifies people, but, I think Stoicism gets harder when you talk about bereavement and tragedies occurring, because I'm not sure you can carry it all the way. But something like public speaking is a good example. You get very, very nervous and anxious. If you try to reassure yourself or somebody else that it's all going to be okay, then whenever you do that, you're sort of inadvertently reinforcing the idea that if things weren't okay, that would be a total catastrophe. And the big insight from Stoicism and up through people like Albert Ellis, the great sort of Stoic influenced psychotherapist who I write about, is far better to sort of play out those, okay, what if it all went wrong? And then you realize that the answer is, well, it would be bad, but it wouldn't be a total catastrophe, than it is to keep firming up this kind of this sort of background notion that whatever happens, you mustn't let everything go wrong. And I think that probably is going to increase the chances of your choking and making it go wrong as well. But, it's great to realize in advance of I've done this in the past. I'm getting a bit better at it now, but, in advance of some sort of event that the worst thing that's going to happen is embarrassment in front of hundreds of people, and that is not as bad as a nuclear bomb landing on your neighborhood.
Right. No, yeah, I agree with you.
I'm glad.
But as you said, in other cases, it might be more problematic. I mean, I guess if you have a fear of flying, imagining the plane you're in going down and you screaming in agony or whatever. I mean, envisioning the negative might be less valuable to somebody with a fear of flying. I don't know.
Yeah, I think as I sort of try to say, I don't think Stoicism myself is an exhaustive, comprehensive way of. I think a lot of people have this view. There's something cold about it. Even if you managed to be the sort of ideal Stoic sage, I think there's a sense in which that feels like it misses the point of life, because you would just be completely calm when the worst possible things happen to your most beloved, friends and family. I actually think, there are circumstances in which thinking about planes crashing would bring a certain kind of calm. But yeah, no, it can be taken. It's not a comprehensive life strategy. I don't think.
But speaking of embarrassing yourself in front of a lot of people, you actually did this exercise on the subway, as I recall. When you tell us about that, and I forget who suggested that. Was it Ellis or?
That came from Ellis, yeah, who I interviewed just a little bit before he died several years ago now.
And he was explicitly Stoic in his orientation. He was a therapist.
He was one of the founding fathers of sort of cognitive therapy. He sort of fell out with the mainstream founders of it, and he fell out with a lot of people. But he had this exercise. He called them shame attacking exercises. He said if you're scared of embarrassing yourself in public, you should deliberately embarrass yourself in public. He gave people this exercise, which I actually did on the London Underground, that he designed. He said originally he used the New York City subway was his example, where you ride on the subway and you just speak out loud the name of every station that you're approaching before you get there,
as if it were your job to announce the stations,
right? So that everyone can hear you in the car.
Do you really like broadcast it, or do they just think you're talking to yourself, or what?
I mean, I started pretty timidly and got a bit louder. I did a central line of the Underground. The thing is, it's so terrifying.
I cannot imagine doing it. It seems.
No, it was. I mean, it was awful. It was particularly awful in prospect, which is kind of the point. But I mean, I think what's really interesting about that is, that this is a Stoic idea, right? That your beliefs about how bad that's going to be and the associated emotional responses are they're at 11 on the dial. And yet this isn't very rational because it's a little bit embarrassing. But
once you start doing it
nothing's going to happen. You're not attacking people or verbally abusing people. Far weirder things go on the New York City subway.
This is safe to say, yes.
Every day. And so by bringing the reality into contact with those thoughts, you sort of cut the beliefs down to size, and you realize, it's not fun. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't do it this afternoon out of choice. But all that happens is a few people look up like you might be crazy, and then they go back to their newspapers because people are obsessed with their own issues. They don't care about you. So that sort of, it's that sort of bringing a belief into a direct encounter with the reality, and you sort of make it finite. It's not that it goes away. It's that you realize that you'd been thinking about it as if it were losing your home or losing your life.
And was Ellis's idea that if you did exercises like this, it would make you less vulnerable to fears in general?
I think so. I mean, partly it feels a bit like exposure therapy, right? You just do the thing enough and then it's going to stop bothering you. But I think it's this idea of coming to see that your beliefs about situations are ultimately what cause distress, which is a sort of heart of the Stoic philosophy. You can then take that in a totally positive thinking way and say, well, so if it's your beliefs that condition your experience of life, make sure you always have really great beliefs and nothing's ever going to go wrong. But I think Ellis really meant, make sure you see that it's your beliefs that are causing the distress, and then get better at seeing when those beliefs are sort of absolutist and terrible. I mean, he took this to an extreme. He was like, anything you can imagine happening to you, you can always imagine something worse, because if it's bad to be murdered, it's worse to be tortured and then murdered, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's no absolutes, but we behave as if there are.
And you note certain similarities between Stoicism and Buddhism, and you explore kind of the world of contemporary Buddhism, or contemporary Western Buddhism, you might say, because you're here, you were in the United States. But first of all, what is the commonality between Stoicism and the kind of Buddhism you were immersing yourself in?
I mean, I think at the broadest level, they just have this sort of negativist orientation, this idea that the first thing to do when you encounter a negative emotion or feeling is not to run away from it, not to try to manipulate it. I think both those traditions have been taken off in directions that do then get really manipulative of things. But what I take sort of Vipassana meditation, which you're far more familiar with than me, I think, actually, but at this point. But the sort of a core part of that is precisely to learn to watch mental contents without succumbing to the sort of compulsive need to try to manipulate them. Thoughts and emotions are like the weather is the cliche that you always hear the American Buddhist teachers in the 21st century using. You don't try and cling on to good weather or hurry the bad weather away, because the sky is the mind is sort of intact regardless. So there's that same kind of I feel like, I don't know, I feel like from my understanding of it, Buddhism feels like an advance on Stoicism, because it feels like it enables you on some level to feel the full gamut of emotions without being completely determined by them. I don't know if you agree with that.
I guess if I understand you correctly, first of all, there may be a more elaborate practical ritual that's developed within Buddhism. Although I know somebody who says he practices Stoic meditation. Apparently, there is such a thing.
Yeah.
But certainly, the meditative aspect of Buddhism is pretty elaborately developed and articulated. What I guess they do have in common, as you note in the book, is in Buddhism, there's this idea that through observing your thoughts and feelings, you realize that they don't have the inherent meaning you tend to associate with them. They don't, the things you're seeing as negative don't have to be negative. That's a judgment you're actually imposing on them. And that insight is articulated by the Stoics, right?
Right. Yeah, seeing it, perceiving the judgment layer in experience, I guess, is one way of thinking about that. And it's now an absolutely key plank of CBT in the modern era, and all sorts of other approaches. But
that's cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah. You then have to decide what attitude, what stance you're going to take to that layer, and I feel like the Buddhist one is more used to me than the Stoic one, because it doesn't rely on this idea of making those judgments comport to rationality, which is a very glib way of talking about Stoicism. They had a huge cosmology, an understanding of what God was, and how compliance with the sort of intentions of the universe was true rationality. So this is a whole other deal.
Okay, but you actually went to one of these meditation retreats, right? A week-long meditation retreat at Insight Meditation Society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how did that go?
Well, as I expect it's amazing how far a distance you travel in your understanding of what you're doing and in your experiences over 6 days or whatever, sitting or walking in exactly the same position, on exactly the same cushion, or in exactly the same sort of empty room. I got there and was sort of delighted by how peaceful and beautiful it was, and then was very quickly very crestfallen about how unpeaceful it was inside my head. And I write in the book that for like a day and a half or something, I had the lyrics to the 1997 Danish pop song Barbie Girl.
It could have been worse. The song that got stuck in my head on my first retreat was "It Feels Like the First Time" by Foreigner.
I'm not sure that is worse, actually.
Oh, that's worse. That's worse than anything. I'm actually not sure I'm familiar with the song you're talking about, but even so, I can guarantee you it's not worse than "It Feels Like the First Time."
Okay, good evidence-based judgment.
Yeah.
But there then comes a moment, and I don't think I have progressed very far, if at all, up the kind of ladder of stages that is spoken about in these traditions. But there is nonetheless a sort of kind of progress, which is that you see how much you are inadvertently sort of objecting to that inner state, and how much you're sort of trying to get calm, and how really that's another form of positive thinking, really, to try to control the mind and to stop thinking. And then, of course, that is the moment when it actually, when you sort of unhook the grip on that, the lyrics of the annoying songs fall away a bit. it's not unbroken calm after that. Then I sort of went through all sorts of, replaying everything bad I'd ever done in my life, kind of.
Yeah, that happens. That happens to a lot of people, and it happened to me. I'm not sure why, but it's no picnic there for a while.
But then I found, by the end of that time, I sincerely feel like if I'd heard it had been extended by 3 or 4 weeks, I would have been fine with that, because this kind of very sort of somewhat militaristic schedule, although I don't think at IMS they're going to kick you out if you go to your room and...
No, you can play hooky. There's nobody keeping attendance. But if you actually do the schedule, it's pretty intense. If you do all the sitting, I mean, by my count, the sitting meditation adds up to 5 or 5.5 hours a day, and the walking meditation, another 5 or 5.5 or something like that. Then you've got like an hour or 45 minutes of work. And, you listen to a Dharma talk before you know it, it's bedtime.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I'm just going to say, like, that framework, by the end, it does become kind of a thing in which you're held rather than a thing that is imposed on you. And you do begin to get a little bit of a sense of how, monastic schedules, I mean, I'm sure I'd go mad very quickly if I dedicated my life to that, but how that kind of fixity is actually very freeing in certain ways, because you're no longer the whim, you're no longer the slave to your own whims about what you feel like doing at any given moment. And that idea, that you don't need to feel like what you have decided to do at a given moment, was just a huge epiphany for me, and helped me actually write the book, because often, I'm sure you'll agree, that many days you're writing a book, you don't particularly have the correct motivational state to do so.
Right. And one issue you confront that I don't know how Stoics confront it actually, but I've heard a lot about how Buddhists confront it, is death. You have a whole chapter on death, and what? And you actually you do a lot of traveling in the book. Actually, you go to Mexico to the what's the name of the festivity, the Day of the Dead or something, where they
yeah. It's pretty. I mean, it's pretty famous now, and especially feels in the last few years. I don't think I'm the cause of that or anything, but they it is, it happens around the same time as Halloween, and you sort of group it mentally, or I did with Halloween, and yet it couldn't really be more different. What goes on around here in Halloween in Brooklyn, which is everyone sharing sweets with candy, with everyone else. It really is about death. There really is a focus on mortality in that kind of memento mori way that of which there's a long tradition in art and literature. So I spent half the night in a cemetery on the outskirts, in the sort of rural outskirts of Mexico City, with families who were, just having a sort of social occasion at the cemetery with their deceased relatives, not making light of it, but also not mourning. It was just a very sort of easy and relaxed thing. And I got to believe that there is some real benefit to sort of letting that kind of gentle awareness of mortality back into your life at times when you don't absolutely have to, because we're all, we're going to encounter it among those close to us or ourselves soon enough. But like that sort of voluntary engagement, and that seems to be really picking up. There's this thing called Death Cafe. You probably
I don't know about it.
It's a group around the world now that is organizing meetings in cafes to drink coffee and eat cupcakes, and talk about death.
And is the express purpose to make them less fearful of it, or?
I think that's part of the original intention, the guy who sort of came up with the idea originally. But I think that, there are a whole multiplicity of benefits. I think it makes it a lot easier to be a helpful person in the context of, friends who are bereaved or whatever, I just think there's that sort of radioactivity associated with it, totally understandably, and probably not completely eliminable, because the idea of it is ultimately so unimaginable. But we sort of make it a lot worse, I think, in our culture by hiding it behind closed doors and pretending that doesn't really happen until we can't avoid facing it.
Now, the people in Mexico celebrating this holiday, they probably believe in an afterlife, right?
Especially in the rural areas, I think that is to be fair, probably true. So there is this element of like, well, maybe they just think that death isn't really a big deal. So
right, it's easy to be playful about death if you don't think it's actually going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a fact in certainly in some of those certainly in some of those areas. But the Day of the Dead is a huge thing in downtown Mexico City, in offices in Mexico City, where I don't have the figures, but I assume that there's a less of a sort of absolute literalist belief in sort of in afterlife type ideas, and it's done humorously, and people write poetry about how their colleagues are going to die. Someone told me they'd done this. There are sort of just all sorts of these things that are sort of reminders of death, and I don't think it. I mean, I think it probably grows out of a culture that has religious beliefs in the afterlife, but I don't think that is the only reason that it functions today. And
you do quote a number of thinkers who are confronting, in a secular context, trying to help you confront the prospect of death. And I guess is it Epicurus who basically makes the argument that, in a way, that you will never be dead, because if you're not dead yet, and if you're dead, you're no longer you, right?
Right.
It's something like that.
Yeah, no, it's a great, I mean, to the extent that you can make yourself believe that, which I think is limited.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I believe it. I understand the logic. He's right. For some reason, I don't find it as thoroughly consoling as he might have hoped.
I mean, I think the problem is that we talk about fear of death, and we don't actually mean fear of death. Partly we mean fear of dying, but mainly we mean, like, outrage at finitude and the sort of total preposterous absurdity of the fact that we don't go on forever. So that isn't helped by that very true observation that there's no subject to worry about. But I think it's helpful for those people who may be worrying that death is a bit like being buried alive or something, floating in black space. But I'm fairly. That's not a fear I have. I have plenty.
No, I've ruled that out. Unless I am buried alive, in which case, even then, once the death happens, I will not be being buried alive. It seems like it's kind of it's kind of the regret that all this stuff isn't going to happen anymore, which is a fact. It's not going to happen to you anymore. All the experiences of being alive, and a sense that I don't know, you'd like to run around and say you're sorry to everybody, and just put, there's never going to be a chance for true closure.
And I think that's right. And I think it also sort of calls into question, this is an old sort of observation, but it calls into question the meaning of anything we do. I don't think it means that what we do is meaningless, but I think it means that according to our usual criteria for judging meaning, that we're somehow accumulating a set of achievements or a set of relationships or merit or whatever it is. If it all is snuffed out at the end, then that calls for a radical recalibration of why we do anything we do, and then you get back into the sort of Buddhist and New Age ideas as
right.
well.
I was going to say, you recommend that recalibration anyway, just on grounds of practical value during your life. You would want people to not be so obsessed with accumulating accomplishment and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would, and I try myself, and I'm not going to claim some huge success at it, but I think that where that all ends eventually is in the sort of idea from Buddhism and other Hindu traditions and all the rest of it about sort of unseating the self as the organizing focus of experience anyway, and that gets into the bit where I went to talk to Eckhart Tolle about his experiences, apparently with a vastly reduced sense of self.
What's your take on him? You think he's legit?
That's the question everyone always asks. I think he's legit, although I also kind of like the thing that Alan Watts said about how even if such people are charlatans, then it's just sort of points up how we're all charlatans and how selfhood is a kind of a joke and a put on. But leaving that aside, I sort of imagined when I went to visit him that I would find him sort of, in a very luxurious setting with all sorts of acolytes and great wealth. It's perfectly nice, the apartment that he lives in Vancouver, but it isn't. It betrays no sign of of any sort of opulence or living in sort of extravagance. And then also just the effect of being in his presence is an extremely interesting and strange and tranquil one. And so I almost don't care whether that counts as some form of hypnotism or manipulation, or whether it's just, the truth shining out. Or
of course, if I were a fraudulent mystic and a journalist were coming to see me, I'd certainly arrange to be seen in a humble abode, I have to say.
You'd hide all the gold.
Yeah. Of course, for people who don't know him, he wrote The Power of Now, super bestseller. But his story is what's odd. He doesn't claim to have gotten to where he is through rigorous meditation. Enlightenment just dawned on him after years of depression and homelessness or something, right?
Yeah, basically, I think he was very, very seriously depressed graduate student. And he tells the story of a sort of evening's crisis where he wakes up or is in bed at night thinking, I cannot live with myself any longer. And that this sort of suddenly triggers the thought that how can there be I and myself? There must be two of me if it's even possible for me to have that thought. And then maybe only one of those is real. And that gets you very swiftly then into the idea of the sort of bigger self versus the ego. I think there's quite a lot of accounts of that sort of thing happening through history. I did try to get him on, was it really completely instant? Did you sort of, after that, everything was was different and remained exactly the same, kind of different forever? And, I think there was sort of development and growth actually after that experience. I don't think he would claim that it was just an absolute sort of change on a knife edge. I also asked him when he last got irritated, because I feel like if you get irritated, there's something still left to do by his own view of the self and ego. And he said that he could remember a time a few months previously when somebody's dog had been bothering another dog at the park, and the thought had occurred to him that this was an unacceptable situation, but that it had sort of evaporated again within seconds. So
once every few months he gets irritated. So by way of exploring this idea that kind of the relentless pursuit of happiness via, material goods and professional accomplishment and so on is not the path to actual happiness, you visit a very poor place, right? To talk about that a little.
I went to Kibera, which is the huge sort of township slum, some people would say, outside Nairobi in Kenya. Partly because it's been a big focus of a lot of sort of psychologically inflected work on people in very, very fragile situations, economically, health-wise, and the rest of it. I was obviously trying to be really careful here, because there's an argument, there's a cliche about the sort of very happy people living in places where there's no reason for them to be very happy. And it very swiftly, either it's just racist sometimes, and in other cases it's sort of incredibly smug, sort of, well, we don't need to worry then. There's no reason to try to change the level of HIV infection in a place like that, or the level of abject poverty, or the lack of proper sanitation, because everyone's fine with it. So I was very clear I was going to try to avoid these conclusions.
Yes, you issue plenty of disclaimers in that regard, I would say. There's no danger of your being mistaken for...
But on the other hand, you see, it's kind of true, right? Because if you live in New York City, you swiftly learn that people are not happy in a way that seems proportionate to their material privilege. And, I don't think I came up with any firm, settled conclusion that ties a bow on it forever. But I think the real the thing that impressed itself upon me spending the time there that I did is just that there is a benefit in being a sort of rather austere benefit, I guess, in being denied the possibility of misplacing your misinvesting your happiness. So if you are never going to be living in anything that resembles an apartment in New York City, and you know it, then you can't get into some weird and unhelpful mental loop where always getting the next best apartment is the thing that gives meaning to your life, until you realize that at the end of it was completely meaningless. You're also sort of thrown back on social networks. You have to develop relationships of trust with people, because that's the only way that you're going to look out for yourself and your family. So then sort of inadvertently, again, you end up doing the things that we're all told to do in our privileged lives, which is spend more time connecting with people and less time seeking material wealth. So there's just a sort of unasked for but kind of edifying thing in the structure of the situation, which I think must account for a lot of the fact that to the best evidence we have, mental health is often better in such places, in very privileged ones.
Now, in terms of kind of level of happiness, I mean, last time I looked at the literature, which was actually a long time ago, 15 or 20 years ago, the finding was that if you compare different countries, the professed level of happiness in different countries, there is value in prosperity up to a fairly low level. In other words, abjectly poor countries, there is less happiness is professed than in slightly less abject poor country, and then you get up to a relatively low GDP per capita, and thereafter, the richer the country, there's no real correlation. Is that still your sense?
Well, that's a very famous finding that I don't know what status it has now, because I do know that there was a big pushback against it in favor of an idea that actually, no, more money does make countries happier pretty much indefinitely. There's also then you get the whole question of equality, and it's to do with the level of difference between people within a country. I mean, at this point, I wouldn't want to issue a verdict on which of those is the right way to think about it. There does seem to be a lot of evidence that that inequality is correlated with unhappiness across the board. That I know that, for example, that when you ask Americans how equal they think society should be, even while professing beliefs in not too much equality, the levels that they name are actually, Swedish levels of equality rather than American levels. So that, I think, is a whole other factor that's been studied a lot recently. The answer is I don't know where that so-called paradox, the threshold thing, sits at the moment. I'm fairly sure an individual person could use almost unlimited amounts of money to get ever more happy, but you'd have to do it by giving most of it away.
Yeah, and the literature has always made a distinction between comparing countries, GDP level of country and average happiness in country, and the separate question of whether within a country getting richer and richer will make you happier. Those are not necessarily going to be the same answer, and I don't know what the state of literature is, but it's a subtle thing to try to figure out. One thing you do is you look. You're clearly, kind of skeptical of the kind of success literature and the business, advice literature. And you make an interesting point that, there's a common approach to coming up with advice for aspiring business people is to look at what successful business people have done, look at a bunch of successful business people and say they had these characteristics, drive, whatever. And so that must say something about the value of this characteristic. And you note there's a pretty obvious methodological flaw there, right?
Right. I mean, it's just survivor bias, right? I mean, if you go and look for millionaires and write that book, The Millionaire Mind, where you dissect what characteristics they share, you've got no way, unless you go and look for it, of telling that there weren't a lot of people with exactly those characteristics who never made it to that status, or more who never made it to that status. You can go a little bit further than that and say that things like you've got to be willing to fail, which you hear all the time, and in a subtler form, I think I sort of do try to defend that claim in the book, but in the sort of glib version of it, there's a scholar I write about who points out, you would expect willingness to fail and take big risks to be correlated with either great success or huge failure. So the fact that you can pick out some great successes doesn't really tell you anything unless you're going to go and look for the failures as well. And just on a popular level, we never hear about those because people don't get asked to write celebrity business autobiographies about their failures unless they were preceded by, very, very big successes first. So if you just try to become Richard Branson and then you just labor in obscurity for the whole of your life, no one's going to want to publish on that.
Right. It's like these anecdotes you hear from these various writers who say, I got rejection letter. The first 700 publishing house I approached rejected me. And then, this is like spread around to inspire. And I'm always thinking, no, don't tell anybody that, because 99% of them are really never going to get published.
Right.
And it's the same with these, these like the Steve Jobs graduation speech where, don't compromise, pursue your vision no matter what. I mean, that's a recipe for most people. That's a recipe for disaster.
And the other thing that's really interesting, I found really interesting anyway, is that when you then look at some of the more sort of qualitative, but in a very sort of nuanced way, studies of successful entrepreneurs, not just the outlying random, very high profile celebrity people, but just people who've steadily been, pursuing ideas and making a big success of them. They aren't stubborn in that way. They don't have these kind of goals where they just desperately try to force reality to comport with their own dreams. They're very sort of responsive. They follow exactly what I would say was a good sort of negative path kind of way of thinking about this. They're ready to change their direction. They don't always know where they're going, so that they're more open to more interesting routes. They, all this stuff. So it's not even true of a lot of the people who do succeed that they followed that advice.
Right. And finally, you talk about something called negative capability. Talk about that's Keats who coins that phrase, or
I blatantly, and I hope openly and transparently in the book, sort of rip this off and take it outside of its original intended meaning. He was talking about literary genius, and he sort of describes this epiphany when he realized that the thing that makes a Shakespeare or a great literary genius is this idea of negative capability, the idea of being able to rest in mysteries and uncertainties without, I think he refers to it as an irritable reaching after fact and reason. So all I take from this, for my purposes, is this idea that it's a concrete skill to not always have to change negative situations, to sort of be able to hang out in situations of uncertainty, insecurity, all sorts of other sort of negative scenarios, without needing to close them up. There was a psychologist called Paul Pearsall who coined this word openture as an opposite of closure, which I kind of like, that there's a real identifiable skill, which is, not always needing to move out of that kind of situation and being able to be with it and follow it where it leads. So that's what I'm using negative capability for. So, sort of a stance towards the whole of life, I guess.
Right. So Keats was talking partly about just being willing to live with uncertainty about things, in terms of your beliefs about the world or beliefs about a given, to be, and you're kind of broadening it to you're turning that into a subset of a larger ability to be just comfortable with all kinds of stuff, like everything.
Yeah, I think he was. I think people have debated for years and years what exactly he meant, but I think he meant that. I take him to mean that hurrying too quickly to a conclusion is not a good way to create great art or to have great ideas. And I think what I like about it and why I sort of plucked it out of that context is just because it's sort of like a figure ground shift, right? It puts a label on something that we usually just think of as the absence of something. Or maybe we think of it as a bad thing always, like aimlessness or being a drifter or something. And I think that sort of recognizing that it's a skill and that it's something to cultivate, and that, if someone's plying you with positive thinking advice, maybe sometimes you want to take it, but you want to weigh it against the sort of what the alternative approach from negative capability would be and make a decision, rather than just assuming that there was nothing there before and now positive thinking steps into the gap and solves all your problems.
Right. I guess the final question I'd ask is, notwithstanding all your skepticism about positive thinking, aren't there people who could use a little more of it?
I think two things. Firstly, I think in a very, very short-term, superficial way, yeah, I mean, certain kinds of buoying yourself up to get yourself out of a little funk are not necessarily going to fail, because those ironic effects in the mind only sort of seem to kick in at a certain level of intensity, the sort of blowback. Then I think when you talk about it working in a more sustainable way, at the risk of a sort of no true Scotsman fallacy or something, I think people are not talking about what I mean by positive thinking. I think bringing in positive arguments to bear on a belief, as you might have in sort of some cognitive behavioral therapy, that isn't this sort of willed attempt to change or to deny reality. That's a reasoned process that I think is totally in tune with Stoicism, especially, and lots of these approaches. But no, I do think that if you keep the definition fairly precise, I don't just mean cheesy books about positive thinking, but this overall idea that we can will ourselves happier, that we can decide we're going to have success and thereby meet with success. I mean, no, I don't really think it's ever helpful. Mm-hmm. There you go.
There you go.
I'll go out on that limb.
Standing by your guns. I admire that. You're thinking positively about your thesis.
Oh, no.
So it's really a funny book, very sharply written and not too long. So it's a brisk and entertaining read. I really recommend it. Let me show people at least the cover of the audible.com file.
Can I be really self-promoting? I've got it here as well.
Oh yeah, do the real book. Is that the paperback?
That's the US paperback. I'm sorry to be such a
shameless self-promoter.
There it is. I'll put it away now.
So it sounds like you're actually pursuing career success, which I'm not sure that your meditation teacher would have recommended. You held that book up there as someone who is trying to attain material and career goals.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think that basically I'm sort of very naturally a goal-oriented person. I think lots of us are. And I think what I'm doing in terms of myself is trying to make sure I put a lot of emphasis on the counterpoint to that, and so that it doesn't spin wildly out of balance. But on some level, I suppose when you put a book out like this, you are hoping that people will take its perspective, put it into practice, and think that you're good as a result. I guess that's unavoidable. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, you could just think of yourself as doing it for the good of the people who are reading the book, but that really would be lying to yourself, I think. So I don't recommend that.
No, I mean, I am doing it for my own interest, intellectual satisfaction. I will say, without the risk of sounding very sort of holier than thou, that the certain emails I've had from certain readers who've found it useful in certain ways, they are the best things. It is a reminder that no other sort of, nothing else makes things as worth doing. But no, I'm not going to claim to be a scientist.
Absolutely. And I would guess that, ironically, the kind of people you start the book with, I mean, the preachers of positive thinking and inspiration, who are advocating that people focus on the pursuit of material goals and career success, would probably often be the last to admit that they are advancing their own careers with those kinds of sermons. But maybe
that industry is so confusing and odd, because firstly, you don't want to admit that, even though it's very obvious what you're doing. Secondly, it doesn't work. So Get Motivated seminars have gone out of business since I went to them. And then thirdly, I just feel if you were one of those people, you would feel like you could never openly display sadness or stress. And when bad things happen to you, which they happen to everyone, it must add a layer of awfulness to have to constantly promote sort of unbroken happiness.
That would be a lot of pressure. We do not live under that burden.
No, exactly.
We do not profess enlightenment.
No.
Okay, well, thanks so much for taking the time, Oliver. It's really a great book. and I hope you write another one.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Okay, take care.